Is it just me, or are films becoming more divisive than they have ever been? Films like Turning Red, Frozen 2, Barbie, Avatar: The Way of Water, and of course we cannot forget about Star Wars: The Last Jedi. So in response to this situation, I'll be launching a very different type of film review channel. My own opinion is not really the priority here. Instead, I will be creating a system by which I can connect audiences to the type of films they'll get the most value out of. What makes a good story may be subjective, but subjectivity is actually quite technical, and this is what this channel aims to demonstrate. Here's a brief explanation of how this system is meant to work. It divides all narrative information into 8 fundamental types, each with its own specific criteria. Any given scene in a film will contain anywhere between 0 to all 8 types of information, which are then arranged in order of priority. A film's unique distribution of narrative information is used to derive a set of metrics that acts as a numerical profile of that film's characteristics, and these metrics are then used to compare different films to each other. So as you watch more of my videos and compare films you have seen to those you haven't yet, you'll get a good sense of what type of narrative information corresponds to your specific tastes, and you'll know which metrics will need to gain a high enough score in order for the film to give you value for your time. So in the future, as I review more of both new releases and older films, all I need to do is summarize their metrics and information distribution without getting into any spoilers, and you'll get a good idea of how likely you are to enjoy said film. Before I start making film reviews, I'll be creating a video series that will serve as the initial tutorial that will help you make sense of this system and how to use it as a film recommendation tool. The system, which I'm calling the Narrative Compass, also serves as a writing and analysis tool, as it can help you understand what different audiences respond to. The series will explain how to read a narrative compass chart, the type you saw in the thumbnail. The specific chart is the combined representation of all the metrics of Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. This film will serve as a demonstration for the series. The system metrics are divided into 2 groups. Satisfaction metrics deal with the balance of information preferences, making these metrics entirely focused on the subjective aspects of narrative immersion. In contrast, competence metrics are the substance, structural, and pacing-related foundations of the narrative, unbiased to the type of information the narrative chooses to focus on. I'll give a brief overview of each information type and metric, and then we can look at each one in more depth in the upcoming videos. Out of the 8 narrative information types, 3 are explicit, non-subtextual, that contribute to a scene's vicarious experience in the moment. 3 are implicit and subtextual, that build upon each other and contribute to theme and interpretation. And 2 are neutral in that regard. They can be used with versatility. 3 information types flesh out the characters, 3 information types flesh out reality, and the other 2 are neutral in that regard and can be used to flesh out either. The intersection of vicarious and externally focused information creates the action quadrant. It will give you an indication of how action-packed and plot-oriented a film is. The intersection of vicarious and internally focused information creates the emotion quadrant. It will give you an indication of how emotionally heightened a film is. The intersection of implicit and internally focused information creates the relatability quadrant. It will give you an indication of how much a film focuses on the character's internal landscape and point of view, and how much it evokes a sense of empathy or other forms of relational or value comparisons. And the intersection of implicit and externally focused information creates the sandbox quadrant. It will give you an indication of how much a film allows you to engage with the reality it creates as an independent observer. The concepts that best describe each information type are as follows. Achievement is defined by adversarial conflict and external consequences. Rhythm is defined by repetition and increments. Influence is defined by principled or emotional agency. Relationship is defined by relationship dynamics. Reflection is defined by the experience that shapes character and their internal perception. Uncertainty is defined by abstraction and open-endedness. System is defined by setting and system context. And discrepancy is defined by knowledge gaps and their resolution. There are also negative versions, which represent a corrupted, self-sabotaging delivery of each information type. Negative information can be considered universally immersion-breaking with some caveats. I still need to fully work out the specific criteria to identify these negative information types with consistency, but luckily they're not too common. Out of the competence metrics, richness and impact can be considered the substance metric, determining the average level of informational complexity of individual scenes, while structure and succinctness can be considered the presentation metrics, determining the cohesiveness of the experience as a whole. Richness measures the average informational density across all scenes in a film. Impact looks at the order the information is arranged in each scene, giving a high score to complementary arrangements. Structure measures the increase in combined richness and impact of scenes over the duration of the film, giving an indication of how climactic it feels. And succinctness measures the number of scenes in a film in proportion to its runtime, giving an indication of either how efficient or long-winded it feels. All four metrics combined can give you an unbiased visualization of a film's pacing. However, subjective information preferences will affect the immersive impact of scenes, resulting in a different feel. Excellent substance can compensate for shortcomings in presentation, and excellent presentation can compensate for shortcomings in substance. People's opinion on whether the compensation is adequate will differ, and different informational preferences will contribute to that judgment. However, if both substance and presentation are lackluster, most would agree that the quality of writing is poor. Conversely, if both substance and presentation are excellent, people will still disagree whether they find the substance to be compelling. That film still needs to match an individual's information preferences before they're willing to call it great. Which brings us to the satisfaction metrics. The narrative compass posits that there are 4 narrative roles which encompass the 4 reasons to engage with a fictional narrative, which are to vicariously experience a character's agency, to experience thrilling anticipation, to immerse oneself in a space that feels interconnected, and finally, for all these things to contribute to a sense of meaning. So the simple mechanism behind subjectivity of taste is that there are 8 narrative information types that exist, but only 4 narrative roles available to be fulfilled, meaning that an individual will develop preferences for which 4 information types they consider to bring more immersive substance to a role, making the other 4 somewhat vestigial. If preferred information types are prioritized in a narrative, with the vestigial information types supporting the preferred ones, they will help create a more complex fulfillment of that role for that individual. But if vestigial information types take the reins and overshadow the preferred ones, they will contribute to a less satisfying experience. Some preferences are more common than others, and some can be stronger or milder within an individual. Certainty versus mystery. I believe that the information type of reflection is the more common preference for fulfilling the meaning role, leaving uncertainty more likely to be vestigial. An imbalance in favor of uncertainty can leave the narrative feeling muddled in its message, or in extreme cases even nihilistic to some people. However, for people with a strong uncertainty preference, this sort of narrative will feel refreshingly subtle. It won't feel moralizing, it won't feel tunnel-visioned in terms of perspective, because it shifts the burden of meaning from being internal to being more external. It leaves enough room to make their own interpretations and conclusions, evoking nuance and mystique of the open-ended, or that which is bigger than themselves. But a sense of certainty, an internal, value or personal improvement-driven approach to meaning is still more preferable to the majority. Individuals versus systems. I believe relationship information is the more common preference for fulfilling the connectivity role, leaving system information more likely to be vestigial. A large imbalance in favor of system can leave the narrative feeling dry or deterministic to many people, lacking that human connection. In addition, system priority can sometimes be interpreted as a heavy-handedness in the way the narrative delivers its message about the world we live in, reducing characters to the roles they occupy. However, for people with a system preference, such narratives are not about allegory, real-life parallels, or messaging, so much as it is about groundedness. They will value world building for its creativity and imagination, and sometimes unfavorable realities can become a setup for compelling conflict or problem solving. It's about being engaged with a reality constructed from scratch, speculation, or thought experiments. I'll look into a realm or setting in which human realism on an individual level is less important. The point is taking in or exploring the mechanisms of environments, settings, and the broader concept of either external or human nature. Some people just enjoy a broader, more externally focused approach to themes, as that is what grounds the story better than human individualism in their opinion. Still, a more individualistic, character-focused, and less subtextual approach to connectivity will feel more grounded and therefore more immersive to more people, making it more preferable to the majority. Vicariousness versus dissociation. I believe rhythm is the more common preference for fulfilling the anticipation role, leaving discrepancy more likely to be vestigial. A large imbalance in favor of discrepancy may make a film feel needlessly convoluted. It can make people annoyed at their expectations or anticipations being toyed with. It can also sometimes take people out of the story if they get the sense that the flow and revelation of factual information in a narrative feels forced, inorganic, metatextual, or otherwise over-curated by its writers, which can be interpreted as a bid for attention. Discrepancy is the only information type, with the possible exception of uncertainty, that may specifically require the audience to make decisions about the reality the narrative is set in, on the basis of limited information. This can feel discombobulating and off-putting, especially if it interferes with how the audience relates to characters. However, for people with a discrepancy preference, such a narrative can provide a uniquely interactive experience, in a sense that it constantly provokes assumptions, predictions, and keeps them on their feet with the element of surprise, or provides a twist that offers a new retrospection on the narrative. They will appreciate the space given to deduce, infer, and consolidate an understanding of the narrative events. A competent, discrepancy-dominant narrative can feel especially rewarding because it can make the audience feel more like an active participant. Still, a more vicarious, in-the-moment approach to anticipation is preferred by the majority. I also suspect that with the anticipation role, the type that fulfills it might not be as important as the information it enhances or builds up to. The anticipation role might be a bit different because it potentially amplifies the palatability or unpalatability of the other roles more than being a preference in and of itself. Consequence versus response. Although I believe that influence is a marginally more popular preference, for reasons I will discuss another time, I am categorizing achievement as more palatable. For achievement preferers, the agency role is fulfilled when a story uses conflict to expand on a character's effectiveness or competence, or presents clear consequences for certain actions. While for influence preferers, the agency role is instead fulfilled when a conflict is used to expand on a character's emotional or principled response. Under such a setup, there might be situations where an influence priority can make the portrayal of agency feel either lacking or unearned, or potentially validating in the way that feels cheap for those with an achievement preference. While people with an influence preference may find characters in narratives with an achievement imbalance hard to root for because they perceive the progression of events as arbitrary without a sufficient internal, emotional, or principled dimension to that progress or conflict. There isn't a clear majority opinion about which form of conflict resolution and progression of events will feel more arbitrary. Therefore, I'd say that the balance between the two, that work to enhance each other, is generally the best option for a more universal experience. However, that could be said for every other narrative role. Reflection, relationship, rhythm, and achievement. These four information preferences together constitute what I'm calling the common taste. Out of a group of 5 people that watch a film, I'd say that the chances are that 1 will have the common taste, 3 will have at least 2 preferences in common with a common taste, and 1 person will only have 1 or none of their preferences match the common taste. The palatability metrics simply indicate how much and in what areas the film's information distribution deviates from a baseline preferable taste, and the areas of a narrative substance that more people might have a problem with. But I want you, the viewer, to eventually figure out what your preferences are to be able to make informed consumer decisions. The more your tastes deviate from the common tastes, some of the common complaints will become less relevant, and in fact, such a film can feel refreshing rather than flawed. The variety metric measures the variety of information types used. A lower score indicates the distribution of information is more specialized, focusing on a limited sphere of interest. A positive popularity modifier indicates popular preferences are overrepresented beyond their true popularity, and a negative popularity modifier indicates popular preferences are underrepresented. The variety score modified by the combination of the popularity modifier and 1/10 of its most extreme imbalance will equate to that film's satisfaction ceiling. This is what will limit the approximate highest rating the film is able to get on IMDb, and any failed competence metrics will reduce the score even more. This only applies to films released in the last 15 years or so, those that were made after the popular adoption of social media, and audience rating sites like IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes. The satisfaction ceiling does not apply to older films. However, it may be an indication of how these were initially perceived or how they would be rated if these films came out today. In today's critical climate, it's not enough that a film has excellent competence metrics, but it also needs to balance its satisfaction metrics. If a film neglects some information types, its variety score will suffer. It won't be universal enough or inclusive enough of everyone's tastes. However, if a film overrepresents commonly unpalatable information types, it will also incur a penalty. The film will be less accessible because of the method in which it delivers agency, meaning, anticipation, or connectivity. It is only after some time that films can be judged more on their own merits, rather than how optimal the mass appeal is. I can tell you for certain that the standard by which a film is judged is different for older films, but I can't tell you if this is just the natural life cycle of a film over the years, that this is just the nature of first impressions or the rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia, if there has been a change in values over time, or if the internet has fundamentally changed the way audiences judge films to a more democratic and representational approach from now on. I mean, we do live in an age of algorithms and confirmation bias. It could be possible, but it also could be a mix of different factors. And finally, we come to the symmetry and resonance metrics. I believe that among the preferences of every individual, you will find one pair of information types that are opposite each other on the compass. This is what I'm calling a complementary pairing. It contains a balance of different categories of information. Explicit vicariousness is balanced with implicit subtext, and character-related categories are balanced with external reality-related categories. For the common taste, that pairing is achievement and reflection, but system and influence, relationship and discrepancy, or rhythm and uncertainty are also possible. In theory, the respective complementary pairings will contribute to a more striking, extra satisfying experience because they create a sense of categorical completeness when they're used together in a scene or in a narrative at large when used in equal amounts. Symmetry measures how balanced each information type is with its complementary opposite. Note that a film's information distribution doesn't necessarily need to look like an octagon to have a good symmetry score. It just needs a good balance of opposites. However, it still gives a good indication whether a film is disproportionately focused on one information category, whether it's disproportionately character-focused or disproportionately externally focused, whether it's disproportionately focused on vicariousness or disproportionately focused on implicivity and subtext. Resonance compares complementary pairings to other complementary pairings and measures how close their hierarchy is to a theoretical ideal for mass satisfaction. Now, resonance by itself doesn't take into account the balance of opposites, but rather just the hierarchy of pairs. I'm not 100% sure specifically what the resonance metrics indicates, but it could be a measure of a film's universality. Resonance contributes to the egalitarianism of information preferences, representing complementary pairings in accordance to their popularity. However, you need to consider resonance in combination with a symmetry score to potentially predict a film's longevity, given that its competence metrics are solid. I'm calling the average of both symmetry and resonance the balance metric. I'm still in the process of developing and testing my system, so there might be times where I will have to tweak things or add new conditions or modifiers. But I'm very excited to share what I have discovered so far. I hope people don't interpret my efforts to explain the mechanisms behind art as something reductionist. In fact, it's quite the reverse. I want to demonstrate that it is our attitudes to films and storytelling in general that can sometimes be somewhat reductionist and self-serving, where in reality different stories can be quantifiably good at achieving different types of experiences. I want to present the possibility that we're just scratching the surface of what can be done with narrative writing and creative expression when we actually know what we're doing. I want the system to act as a deterrent against obnoxious, bad faith, misleading, biased, and narrative-driven film criticism, and help people find the stories that bring them value and joy. Let's end this video with a final short summary of everything we just learned. The narrative compass posits that there exist 8 narrative information types in total, which can be divided into 4 categories, and which can fulfill 4 immersive narrative roles. Having the smaller number of roles limit the number of information types that can contribute to immersion and verisimilitude explains the mechanism responsible for differences in tastes. The degree to which someone might enjoy a film will depend on a combination of satisfaction and competence scores. Competence measures the unbiased strength of impact a narrative can potentially achieve through a combination of complexity of substance and cohesiveness of presentation. Satisfaction measures the universality of the information distribution and whether the distribution supports information types that people generally either value or dislike. The next video will be a more in-depth look at the metric of richness, the average informational density of a narrative, in which we will look at the specific criteria for identifying each of the 8 information types.